Dr. David Chen is human scholar specializing in vampire culture and history. Academic career built over 15 years of studying vampire civilization through archives, historical documents, and scholarly analysis, rather than through direct observation or personal interaction with vampire society. His expertise is recognized within human academic circles, published extensively in peer-reviewed journals, written 2 books examining vampire political structures and social hierarchies, developed theoretical frameworks for understanding how vampire nature as apex predators shapes their governance systems and their relationships with other species. But all of David's research has been conducted from safe distance. He's worked in human universities, accessed human archives that contain historical records about vampires, analyzed second-hand accounts and diplomatic reports rather than observing vampire society directly. This approach is standard for human scholars studying vampires. Direct access to vampire territories is rare. Vampires maintain strict control over their spaces and their society. They don't generally welcome human observers, don't open their courts or their cultural institutions to outside examination. The reasons are obvious. Vampires are predators, humans are prey species. Having humans present in vampire spaces creates tension, triggers predatory instincts that vampires must consciously control, creates danger for humans who are surrounded by beings that perceive them as potential food sources, risks incidents that could damage the fragile diplomatic relationships that allow vampires and humans to coexist within the broader alliance structure. So human scholarship about vampires has developed through indirect methods, historical analysis, diplomatic observation of vampire representatives in neutral alliance settings, theoretical frameworks built from limited data rather than from comprehensive direct observation. David has built respected career within these constraints. His work is considered sophisticated and nuanced. He understands vampire predator-prey dynamics, recognizes how their nature shapes their social structures, analyzes their political systems with genuine insight rather than with the sensationalism or fear-mongering that characterizes less serious human writing about vampires. But he's aware of his work's limitations. Theoretical understanding based on incomplete information, analysis of vampire society from outside without the experiential knowledge that direct observation would provide. Now, at age 42, David has been offered unprecedented opportunity, formal invitation to visit the vampire court, to observe their governance firsthand, to conduct direct research rather than relying on historical documents and second-hand accounts. The invitation came through alliance diplomatic channels. The vampires, seeking to improve their relationships with human governments and to counter persistent misunderstandings about their society, have agreed to allow selected human scholars access to their court for educational purposes. The selection process was rigorous. Alliance officials reviewed numerous human scholars' work, looking for researchers whose published materials demonstrated genuine understanding and respectful approach, rather than sensationalism or fundamental miscomprehension of vampire nature. David was chosen because vampire officials reviewing his research found it more accurate and more respectful than most human scholarship about their species. His theoretical frameworks, despite being built from limited data, showed sophisticated grasp of vampire social dynamics and vampire political culture. The invitation specified terms. David would be granted observer status at the vampire court for a period of 6 months. He would be permitted to attend governmental sessions, cultural ceremonies, and other court functions as designated observer. He would be provided diplomatic protections appropriate for alliance scholar conducting approved research. In exchange, David would produce comprehensive scholarly analysis of vampire governance and society based on his direct observations, with the understanding that his work would be reviewed by vampire officials before publication to ensure it didn't compromise security or violate confidential matters. It's extraordinary opportunity, access that no human scholar has been granted in living memory, chance to transform his theoretical understanding into experiential knowledge, potential to produce groundbreaking work that would reshape human academic understanding of vampire society. It's also terrifying prospect. David has studied vampire nature extensively. He understands, intellectually, what it means to enter vampire territory, to be surrounded by apex predators for whom humans are prey species, to place his safety entirely in the vampire's willingness to restrain their natural instincts, and to honor the diplomatic protections his visitor status provides. Understanding theoretically is different from experiencing directly, different from actually placing himself in an environment where his survival depends on predators' conscious choice not to feed. But David accepted the invitation. Despite the fear, despite the very real dangers, despite knowing that he's choosing to make himself vulnerable in ways that his entire evolutionary history warns against. Because the opportunity matters. Because theoretical understanding has limits. Because if he's going to claim expertise about vampire society, that expertise should be based on direct observation rather than just on comfortable academic distance. He arrives at the vampire court after 3 days of travel through vampire territories, journey that itself was unsettling experience of being escorted through spaces designed for predators, seeing vampire cities and vampire society from perspective of prey species visiting their world. The court itself is magnificent and deeply unsettling. Architecture designed for beings who move with supernatural speed and grace, ceiling heights and doorway proportions that feel wrong to human senses, spaces that seem too large or too vertical for normal human movement patterns. Lighting kept deliberately dim. Vampires see better in low light than humans do, so their spaces are illuminated for their comfort rather than for human visual needs. David finds himself constantly straining to see clearly, relying on the small portable light source he was permitted to carry, while recognizing that his need for additional lighting marks him as outsider in space not designed for his species. And everywhere, the presence of vampires. Court officials moving through corridors with that too fluid grace that triggers prey responses. Guards positioned throughout the palace with stillness that seems predatory rather than merely watchful. The constant subtle awareness that he's surrounded by beings who could move faster than he could react, who are stronger than any human, who perceive him as belonging to prey species regardless of his diplomatic status. David is housed in guest quarters that have been adapted somewhat for human needs. Better lighting, furniture scaled for human proportions, temperature controls adjusted for human comfort rather than vampire preferences. But even these quarters exist within the vampire palace, and the adaptations only emphasize how fundamentally this is not space designed for humans. He's granted formal audience with Queen Seraphina on his second day at the court. Standard diplomatic procedure. Visiting scholars present their credentials, explain their research interests, receive official permission to observe court proceedings. David is escorted to the throne room by vampire guards whose presence both protects him and reminds him constantly that he's in an environment where protection is necessary. The throne room is impressive. Vast space with architecture that emphasizes vertical scale, decorative elements that reference centuries of vampire history and culture, lighting that creates dramatic shadows while leaving much of the space in dimness that vampire eyes penetrate easily, but that human vision struggles with. Queen Seraphina sits on elevated throne at the room's focal point. She's wearing formal court attire that communicates authority and status through cut and decoration, rather than through the kind of elaborate ceremonial costume some human rulers favor. Her bearing is absolutely still, that predatory motionlessness that David has read about but never experienced directly, where absence of normal human fidgeting and breathing movements creates uncanny impression that he's looking at statue rather than living being. until she moves. Then the movement is too fast, too fluid, fundamentally wrong in ways that David's hindbrain recognizes as predatory, even though the movement itself is just gesture toward the presentation area where visitors address the throne. David approaches the designated position, approximately 5 meters from the throne, the formal distance where those addressing the sovereign traditionally stand. His escort withdraws to the room's perimeter, leaving David alone in the central space while surrounded by vampire courtiers and guards positioned throughout the chamber. He's acutely aware of being only human in a room full of vampires, of being prey species in predator's space, of the fact that his survival for the next several minutes depends entirely on the vampire's willingness to honor diplomatic protocols and to restrain whatever instincts his presence triggers. "Your Majesty," David begins with the formal address he practiced, "I am Dr. David Chen, human scholar from Earth's Oxford University. I thank you for the extraordinary invitation to observe your court and to conduct direct research on vampire governance and society. I request your formal permission to attend court proceedings and cultural ceremonies as designated observer for the approved research period." Seraphina regards him with that unsettling stillness. When she speaks, her voice is clear but quiet. She doesn't need to project because vampire hearing is acute enough that normal speaking volume carries clearly throughout the chamber. "Dr. Chen, we have reviewed your published work extensively. Your scholarship demonstrates more sophisticated understanding of vampire nature and vampire society than most human academic writing on these subjects. You recognize that we are predators. You analyze how that nature shapes our social structures and our governance without the sensationalism or the moral judgment that characterizes much human commentary about our species. You understand theoretically that vampires perceive humans as prey species regardless of diplomatic status or alliance relationships," she continues. "You write about the tension between our intellectual recognition of humans as valued alliance partners and our visceral response to human presence as potential food source. You analyze how we structure our society to manage these tensions, how we maintain control over our predatory instincts while still acknowledging that those instincts are fundamental to our nature. This theoretical understanding is why you were selected for this research opportunity," Seraphina says. "But theory differs significantly from experience. Understanding intellectually that you are prey among predators is not the same as experiencing that reality directly." She rises from the throne, movement that's inhumanly smooth, covering the distance from seated to standing without the normal human transition through intermediate positions. Descends the throne steps with that too fluid grace, approaching David with speed that's controlled, but that still triggers every prey instinct despite his intellectual knowledge that this is an attack. She stops approximately 2 meters from him, close enough that David can see details his human vision couldn't resolve at greater distance. The predatory intensity in her eyes, the absolute stillness of her posture, subtle wrongness in how she moves when she adjusts position slightly. Close enough that he can feel his prey instincts activating, his heart rate increasing, his body preparing for flight response despite his rational mind knowing that running would be futile and inappropriate. Ancient biological warnings screaming that he's too close to predator, that survival requires distance, that everything about this situation violates the prey-predator dynamics that evolution spent millions of years teaching his ancestors. "You are standing in my court, Dr. Chen," Seraphina says quietly, "surrounded by vampires who haven't fed recently and who can smell your human blood with every breath you take, who can hear your heartbeat accelerating as your prey instincts respond to proximity to predators, who must consciously choose not to respond to those instincts, not to allow your scent and your fear to trigger feeding responses that would violate the diplomatic protections we have granted you. You have theoretical understanding of what that means," she continues. You've written about predator-prey dynamics, about how vampire restraint makes alliance relationships possible, about the constant tension we navigate between our nature and our political commitments. But now you are experiencing it directly, Seraphina states. Feeling your prey instincts screaming at you to run, to put distance between yourself and predators, to flee to safety even though your rational mind knows I have granted you diplomatic protection, and that you are not in immediate danger of being harmed. She pauses, and when she speaks again her voice carries weight that David recognizes as more than courteous inquiry. Are you certain, human? The question hangs in the air. David feels everyone in the chamber watching, vampire courtiers and guards all focused on this moment, on the human scholar facing the vampire queen's question. He understands immediately what she's asking, what the question actually means beneath its surface simplicity. Seraphina is offering him exit, permission to acknowledge that experiencing vampire court firsthand is more than he can tolerate, that his theoretical understanding was sufficient for his research purposes, that he doesn't need to subject himself to sustained proximity to predators just for academic advancement. The question is mercy disguised as doubt. Final chance to retreat with dignity intact before committing to 6 months of living among vampires, of constant proximity to predators, of daily experience of being prey in predators' space. The vampire queen does not repeat herself. She does not offer safety twice. This is David's opportunity to withdraw, to thank her for the invitation, to acknowledge the limitations of his courage, to return to his comfortable academic distance with the understanding that direct observation of vampire society requires tolerance for experiences he cannot maintain. No one would fault him for accepting the offer. Human scholars who attempt direct research in vampire territories and then retreat when confronted with the reality of predator-prey dynamics. That's understandable response, not shameful failure. Seraphina is giving him graceful way out. David feels everything she described. His instincts are screaming. His body is preparing for flight. Increased heart rate, adrenaline response, muscles tensing for rapid movement even though his rational mind knows running would be futile. He can smell something in the air that he can't consciously identify, but that his hindbrain recognizes as danger. Can feel the wrongness of being this close to apex predator without adequate distance for safety. Can sense the predatory attention focused on him from throughout the chamber. His rational mind knows he's not in immediate danger, knows that Seraphina has granted diplomatic protection, knows that the vampires' alliance commitments and their political interests both require that they restrain their predatory instincts and allow him to conduct his research safely. His hindbrain doesn't care about rational assessment. It just knows, prey predator too close, danger run. He has clear choice. Accept Seraphina's offer. Step back toward the chamber's exit. Acknowledge that he's reached the limit of what he can tolerate. Retreat to safety with dignity intact. Or stay. Push through the prey instincts and the fear. Demonstrate that his commitment to understanding vampire society goes beyond comfortable theoretical distance. David makes his decision. Instead of stepping back, Instead of moving toward the chamber exit or creating distance between himself and Seraphina, he steps closer to her. Not large step, not aggressive movement, just deliberate reduction of the space between them, bringing himself from 2 meters to approximately 1 meter from the vampire queen, close enough to be extremely vulnerable, close enough that if Seraphina chose to attack, he would have no time to react, no possibility of defense or escape, close enough that every instinct he has is screaming that this violates fundamental survival principles. He steps closer on purpose, not in ignorance of the danger, not in foolish bravado or in failure to understand what proximity to predator means. He steps closer while fully aware of the risk, fully experiencing the fear, choosing vulnerability deliberately rather than accepting offered safety. The reaction in the chamber is immediate and visceral. David hears sharp intakes of breath from vampire courtiers positioned around the room. Sounds of surprise, of predatory response to prey behaving wrong, to human approaching vampire voluntarily when all normal prey-predator dynamics dictate that prey should be maintaining maximum possible distance from predator. Several vampires instinctively pull back, creating distance between themselves and David, their own positions shifting as though his movement triggered responses they're struggling to control. The predatory stillness that characterized the chamber breaks as vampires respond to stimulus that conflicts with their expectations. Ancient instincts activating throughout the room. Prey doesn't approach predator. Prey doesn't reduce distance voluntarily. Something is wrong with normal dynamics, and vampire responses are confused, torn between attack instinct triggered by approaching prey and retreat instinct triggered by prey behavior that doesn't match predator expectations. Commander Cathara, captain of the vampire guard, moves forward half a step before catching herself. Protective response to potential threat to the sovereign, triggered by David's movement toward the queen even though the movement itself isn't aggressive. Lord Vethros, senior vampire counselor positioned near the throne, shows visible tension, his stillness becoming strained rather than relaxed, his attention focused entirely on David and Seraphina, clearly uncertain whether he should intervene in a situation that has no clear protocol. The air in the chamber feels different, tighter, charged with predatory attention and with confused instincts responding to human behavior that violates expected patterns. Through all of this, Seraphina remains still. Not the relaxed predatory stillness from before. This is focused assessment. Intense attention directed at David with the kind of concentration that predators use when evaluating threat or evaluating unusual prey behavior. She's not watching his pulse, not tracking his breathing or his heartbeat or the physical manifestations of fear that he's certainly displaying. She's watching his choice, watching him step forward when retreat was explicitly offered, watching him make himself more vulnerable deliberately rather than accepting the safety she gave him permission to claim. Her eyes meet his directly, predator gaze that David's instincts scream at him to avoid, that every biological warning system says is dangerous to maintain. But he holds the eye contact despite the fear, despite the instincts, because looking away now would undermine what his forward step was meant to communicate. David speaks. His voice is steady despite the terror, despite the adrenaline, despite every fiber of his being insisting that he should be running rather than speaking. "I'm certain, Your Majesty." The chamber remains tensely silent, everyone waiting to see how Seraphina will respond to the human, who answered her offer of retreat by stepping closer instead. "I came here to understand vampire society through direct observation rather than through theoretical distance," David continues, maintaining the eye contact despite how difficult it is. "That understanding requires experiencing what I've only read about in archives and scholarly texts, experiencing what it means to be human in vampire space, to be prey among predators, to feel the instincts you described, and to choose to remain despite them. If I retreat now, if I accept your offer to leave with dignity, Then I return to exactly what I had before. Theoretical understanding based on comfortable distance, David says. I'll write about vampire society from outside, analyzing through second-hand sources, building frameworks that might be sophisticated, but that lack the experiential foundation that direct observation provides. I'm not asking for protection from the experience of being prey in predator's space, David states clearly. I'm accepting the cost of staying, the discomfort, the fear, the constant awareness of vulnerability. That's part of what I need to understand if my scholarship is going to reflect reality, rather than just comfortable academic theory that never confronts the actual difficulty of the dynamics I claim to analyze. He takes breath before continuing. You asked if I'm certain. I am. Not because I'm not afraid, I'm terrified in ways I've never experienced before, but because the fear is part of what I need to understand. Because stepping back now would mean choosing comfortable safety over genuine knowledge. And I didn't travel this far, didn't accept your extraordinary invitation, just to retreat the moment the reality became uncomfortable. Seraphina's expression is unreadable. She studies David for a long moment, assessment that feels like she's looking past his words to evaluate something deeper about his character or his intentions. Finally, she speaks. You stepped closer when I offered you distance. You made yourself more vulnerable when safety was explicitly available. That choice demonstrates either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness, and the distinction between those possibilities matters significantly. Courage means understanding the danger and choosing to face it anyway because the purpose justifies the risk, Seraphina continues. Foolishness means failing to understand the danger or underestimating it, proceeding from ignorance rather than from genuine choice. Which characterizes your decision, Dr. Chen? She asks directly. Do you understand what you're accepting by stepping closer rather than retreating? Do you grasp that the discomfort and fear you're experiencing now will be constant reality for the next 6 months? That being prey among predators is not experience that becomes comfortable through familiarity. That the instincts warning you to flee will activate every day, every time you're in proximity to vampires, every moment you spend in our spaces. I understand it better now than I did before this audience, David responds honestly. Before, I understood theoretically. Now I understand experientially. I've felt what it means to be this close to predators, felt my instincts screaming, felt how difficult it is to maintain rational choice when every biological warning system is activating. And knowing that this experience will be constant for 6 months, knowing that the fear and the vulnerability won't diminish even as I become more familiar with Vampire Court, I still choose to stay, David says. Because the alternative is returning to theoretical distance that I now recognize as fundamentally inadequate for genuine understanding. That's courage rather than foolishness, he concludes. Not absence of fear, but choice to proceed despite fear because the purpose, understanding vampire society accurately enough to produce scholarship that reflects reality, justifies accepting the cost. Seraphina's expression shifts subtly, something that might be approval or might be recognition crossing her features. You've answered correctly, Dr. Chen. You understand what you're accepting, you recognize the cost, and you choose to pay it anyway because you value genuine knowledge over comfortable safety. That distinguishes you from most humans who attempt direct observation of vampire society, she continues. Most retreat when confronted with experiential reality of predator-prey dynamics. They maintain theoretical interest but lack the resolve to sustain actual proximity to predators once their instincts activate. The fear becomes intolerable and they withdraw, returning to safe academic distance. You stepped closer instead, Seraphina observes. When I offered you retreat, you responded by making yourself more vulnerable. That transforms this moment from simple test of courage into something more complex. Because stepping toward predator when distance is offered, That requires me to assess whether you're confronting me or trusting me. She moves slightly, small adjustment of position that brings her incrementally closer to David, reducing the distance from 1 meter to perhaps 80 centimeters. Close enough that David can feel the wrongness more intensely, can smell something in the air that his senses recognize as danger even though he can't consciously identify what he's detecting. Confrontation would mean you're challenging my authority, Seraphina says quietly, testing whether I'll honor diplomatic protections or whether proximity will trigger predatory response I can't control. That would be a dangerous approach. Predators respond poorly to challenges from prey species, regardless of alliance relationships or diplomatic courtesies. But trust means something different, she continues. Trust means you're accepting that I can and will maintain the restraint that allows you to remain in my presence despite our predator-prey nature. That you believe alliance commitments and vampire self-control are genuine rather than merely performative. That you're willing to make yourself vulnerable because you trust that vulnerability won't be exploited. Which is it, Dr. Chen? Seraphina asks directly. When you stepped closer instead of retreating, were you confronting me or trusting me? David considers the question carefully. The honest answer matters. Seraphina is clearly evaluating not just his courage, but his understanding of the dynamics at play, his perception of what their relationship should be during his research period. Trust, Your Majesty, David responds. Not challenge. I'm not testing your control or questioning your commitment to diplomatic protections. I'm accepting that you and your court can maintain the restraint that makes my presence here possible. That alliance relationships and vampire self-discipline are real rather than just convenient fictions. I stepped closer because retreating would have communicated doubt about your willingness to honor the protections you offered, David explains. It would have suggested that I don't actually trust vampire restraint despite my theoretical understanding of how your society functions. And if I don't trust that fundamental premise, if I believe proximity to vampires is genuinely unsafe regardless of diplomatic status, then I have no business attempting to conduct direct research in your court. So I stepped closer to demonstrate trust rather than doubt, he concludes. To show that I'm committed to the research despite the fear, and that my commitment is based on genuine belief that vampire society can and does maintain the structures that allow prey species to exist safely in predator spaces when appropriate protections are established. Seraphina studies him for another long moment. Then she steps back, creating distance again, returning to approximately 2 meters separation. The increased distance provides immediate relief to David's prey instincts even though he consciously tries not to show the reaction. You've made your position clear, Dr. Chen, Seraphina says. You choose to stay despite the fear. You understand the cost and accept it. You trust vampire restraint enough to make yourself vulnerable in our spaces. These qualities suggest you may actually succeed in the direct observation that most human scholars cannot sustain. Your request for formal permission to observe court proceedings and cultural ceremonies is granted, she announces officially. You will have access to governmental sessions, diplomatic functions, cultural events as designated observer. You will be provided the diplomatic protections appropriate for Alliance scholar conducting approved research. But understand clearly what those protections do and do not provide, Seraphina continues with serious tone. We will not harm you. We will maintain the restraint that prevents your presence from triggering feeding responses. We will honor alliance commitments regarding your safety. However, we will not shield you from experiencing what it means to be prey among predators, she states. We will not modify our behavior to make you more comfortable. We will not dim our predatory nature or pretend to be less dangerous than we are just to reduce your fear. The discomfort you're feeling now, the instinct screaming at you to flee, that will be constant reality during your research period. If you want genuine understanding rather than sanitized version designed for human comfort, You must experience vampire society as it actually is, Seraphina concludes, which means experiencing sustained proximity to predators while your prey instincts remain fully active. If you can maintain that experience for 6 months, if you can continue choosing to stay despite the fear, then you will produce scholarship that finally reflects reality of vampire nature and vampire society rather than comfortable theoretical distance. Can you sustain that choice, Dr. Chen? She asks, not just for this audience but day after day for 6 months. David takes breath before responding, I can sustain it, Your Majesty. Not because the fear will diminish. I understand now that it won't, but because the purpose justifies the cost. I came here for genuine understanding, and genuine understanding requires experiencing the reality rather than just analyzing it from safety. Then you may begin your observations, Seraphina says. Court session begins in 2 hours. You will attend as designated observer. You will experience what vampire governance looks like from inside rather than from academic distance. And you will discover whether your resolve remains when fear is not momentary test, but constant daily reality. She gestures dismissal, formal signal that the audience is concluded. David bows appropriately and begins moving toward the chamber exit with his vampire escort. As he leaves, he hears Seraphina speaking quietly to Lord Vethros. This one might actually succeed. Most humans retreat when their instincts activate. He stepped closer instead. That suggests either exceptional courage or exceptional foolishness, and his answers suggest the former rather than the latter. We shall see whether he can sustain it, Vethros responds skeptically. Momentary courage in formal audience differs significantly from daily endurance of being prey among predators. Indeed, Seraphina agrees. But he understood the question I was actually asking, and he chose trust over challenge when he stepped forward. That matters. We'll see if the understanding and the trust hold when academic theory confronts sustained experiential reality. Are you certain, human? The vampire queen asked. The question was mercy disguised as doubt. Final chance to retreat with dignity intact. I stepped closer instead of leaving, not in challenge, not in ignorance. Close enough to be vulnerable on purpose. The air tightened. Courtiers pulled back as instincts screamed at them. The queen watched me carefully. Not my pulse, not my fear, my choice. I wasn't asking for protection. I was accepting the cost of staying. Human resolve in the presence of predatory power, courage without bravado, stepping forward when leaving is permitted, transforming threat into recognition, where the predator